There's a very interesting update coming to the Xbox Series S for the GTK, and it is going to be improving the graphics performance. Welcome back to another video, guys. If you guys are new here, you like what you see throughout this video, please consider hitting that subscribe button to help grow this channel. But with that out of the way, let's talk about this, the Xbox Series S. When the console was first launched, when it was first announced, people were saying that it was a console that was going to hold back this generation of gaming, and with the price point and everything and the fact that it was weaker than everything else, it really hasn't done that whatsoever. Cheaper console, it's a very good entry point into the Xbox Game Pass and to Xbox ecosystem, and it performs extremely well, especially again for the amount that you're paying for it. When you're getting games that are going up to 120 frames per second, you're able to play games such as Call of Duty Warzone at 120 frames per second, Overwatch, Halo Infinite, Halo the Master Chief Collection, and some of these really big first-person shooters that are extremely popular. The fact that you can take the Xbox Series S, plug it into a monitor that has 120 hertz and get the 120 FPS out of it, to me is absolutely an incredible deal and just a great thing that Xbox did this generation. And it's really helped overall with their sales, especially when you look at different regions of the world and with the supply constraints going on. The Xbox Series S has been that console that people have been gravitating towards. Now, we have a new update for the Xbox Series S that is extremely interesting. I think it's going to do a lot for developers going forward, but let's go through it. So it says here, Microsoft is giving the Xbox Series S game developers more control over the memory on the console. A new Xbox software development kit has been released to developers recently, and it frees up more memory for developers to access the Xbox Series S games and boost performance in certain titles. So here is exactly the quote from what Microsoft is saying about this. Hundreds of additional megabytes of memory are now available for Xbox Series S developers. This gives developers more control over memory, which can improve graphics performance in memory constrained conditions. So right now, like I said, the Xbox Series S, $299. Great deal for what you're getting out of it, for the production it does for the games and how well they run, and the ability to actually get up to 1440p gaming, up to 120 frames per second. Although we have been seeing throughout this generation, the majority of games go around 1080p. Sometimes they're dynamic 900p to 1080p, depending on what mode you're in the actual game itself. And the biggest difference between the Xbox Series S and the Xbox Series X would be that GPU and the actual RAM and the memory within the two consoles. The CPU are identical between both of them, again, which is another big thing. But it says here, Microsoft's larger, more powerful Xbox Series X console ships with far more GPU power, but it also has 16 gigabytes of RAM, while the smaller Xbox Series S only has 10 gigabytes. Developers have to work with around 8 gigabytes of memory on the Series S, as Microsoft reserves around 2 gigabytes for OS tasks. Now, when it comes to the OS itself, we have seen recently that the boot times are faster, so I'm wondering if they've done something within this to free up some resources just for the overall load up of the console itself, because I think it's taken off about 5 seconds from when you power on the console from an absolutely powered off state to when it actually gets into the dashboard. And with those memory constraints, there have been developers that, if anything, the biggest difference that holds back developers when developing for the Xbox Series S, it isn't the GPU, it isn't the CPU, it is the actual memory constraints within the Xbox Series S. It says here, it's less the CPU and GPU power of the Xbox Series S, particularly as the Series S has the same CPU as the X, but more the memory situation. And Microsoft's improvements, albeit small, could help reduce some of the friction around developing games for the Xbox Series S. And Xbox says here as well, it addressed an issue where graphics virtual addresses were being allocated considerably slower than non-graphics virtual addresses. So all of this, to be said, is within this GTK, within the June update for Xbox. They have made changes to give more memory allocation for developers when making games for the Xbox Series S, which will in all likelihood be able to improve the actual graphics performance for this console. More games are going to be hitting better frame rates at higher resolutions, all of that type of stuff. Now, we look at this and we think this is a great thing, but we still haven't even seen the extent to what these consoles can do, especially because developers haven't fully utilized that RDNA 2 technology yet with the Fidelity FX features, which I think is going to be huge. And I think with the Xbox Series S in particular, those features are going to have a big upgrade for how the games perform overall. Not that they're performing bad now, but being able to have a steadier 1080p resolution with those higher frame rates, I think is going to be a huge thing. And in particular, when it comes to development and things that people have heard around the industry as to the Xbox Series S and is it going to hold back development, all that type of stuff. We've seen a couple of examples. First, when these consoles release, and just as this generation has gone on. First of all, this is Thomas Salah, who's the creator of the Falconeer, which was a game that came out on the Xbox Series S and X at launch, and he called the Series S a really great bit of kit, saying, and with some simple math, one can see the jump from 1080p to 2160p is one of at least a factor of 4. So would a Series S be able to make a big AAA mid-generation title and run it at 1080p or 1440p? I say that is highly likely. Continuing here, saying, from my experience, Microsoft has put its money where its mouth is and delivered that promise in the Series S. Just talking about in general how the Series S isn't going to be something that holds back developers from being able to create these big next generation games that run and perform well on that little tiny console that only costs $300. We also have the Warhammer 40K Darktide developer saying here, while the Series S will be yet another platform to contend with that will take some time in testing and quality assurance, many developers nowadays are used to a much more dynamic ecosystem of hardware. Even in the console space, we have had different tiers of the same consoles for many years. The way the Series S differs from the Series X, memory amount, GPU horsepower mostly, is for us much easier to adapt to than, for example, a wide variety of PCs out in the wild, or the way that the previous generation of consoles differed. And which, I mean, I completely agree with. It makes a ton of sense. You look at game development today, they are creating games that can run on just huge varieties of PCs out there, different GPUs, different CPUs, different memory, SSDs, all that type of stuff, right? It's completely different on every single PC from every person out there that is actually playing the game. And there's a lot more specifications that they need to keep in mind than just knowing the set specification of the Series S and the Series X and the PS5. Continues here saying, less memory and slower GPU are things that most game developers can dynamically scale for by scaling resolutions and graphics effects, while different storage solutions or widely varying CPU performances are much harder to adapt to. All in all, we don't think that the Series S will significantly limit the game development progress as a whole in any way. And these are all things that developers have talked about with the Series S, but there's also been people on the other side who were not as satisfied with the Series S, thinking that there was some constraint with the development of the game because of the console. And we hear about that here from Digital Foundry. In one of their recent videos, they said here that they've heard from many developers that the Xbox Series S is a pain to work with, and it isn't due to the power of its CPU or GPU, but the constraints placed on it by its memory. Many players are a little bit shocked by this news, especially as it is the beginning of a new generation. This was back on May 13th, 2022. Now, again, with that being said, it is pretty obvious, I would say, with the fact that Xbox and Microsoft, they are freeing up more memory resources, that developers have come to them and said, hey, we need some more memory to improve the actual graphics and performance of games on the Xbox Series S. And the good news is Xbox has gone ahead and they've done that, and they've freed up some more of those resources. So we'll see how this all improves with games coming out on the Xbox Series S. But I would say overall, especially even with games like Bright Memory Infinite, which we just saw come out, the Series S is doing extremely well. I mean, you look at the specifications here. With this game itself, although there's only one mode on the Xbox Series S, it is hitting 1440p at 60 frames per second, which isn't far behind the standard mode on the PS5 at 1800p at 60 frames per second, which is extremely cool to see that that console at that price is able to push a game that I think looks very good at that resolution and at that frame rate. But that's it for me, guys. What are your thoughts on the Xbox Series S? What do you think about the resources being freed up from the memory? And do you think this is really going to help developers make better performing and looking games on the console? If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that thumbs up button. If you're new here, you liked what you saw, please consider hitting that subscribe button and help this channel grow and help grow this community. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for your support, and I'll catch you in the next video.